Boldwood presents Dark Shadows over Coronation Close, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Anne Dover. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. April 1938. Her daughters having gone to bed, Jenny Crawford drew the curtains against the night and prepared to sit down and do some mending whilst listening to the wireless, but swiftly changed her mind. This is the 28th of April 1938, and this is the third news of the day. The time is 9 p.m. Neville Chamberlain stated that he was hopeful that they could agree on a mutual strategy regarding the Sudeten region in Czechoslovakia, and that rumours of the likelihood of war were greatly exaggerated by those who— "I don't want to know," Jenny Crawford snapped. She turned it off with as much fervour as someone might wring a chicken's neck. War. The word of the moment. She heard it from neighbours and even from women waiting to be served in the greengrocer's. The sooner it went away, the better. But all she could do for now was not listen to the news. Broadcasts on the BBC began at 10:15 in the morning with the morning service. The first news of the day wasn't broadcast until 6 p.m. After that, it became crammed in every evening. She used to listen a lot more before all this talk of war. Bram Martin and his orchestra was pleasing. A play or half-hour of comedy was uplifting. Listening to the wireless on an evening had always constituted her own private hour or so after her daughters, Tilly and Gloria, had gone to bed. Nowadays, she was careful what time she tuned in. It wasn't that long since the Great War, when millions from all over the world had died, and not just those in uniform. Zeppelins had flown over London and the home counties, dropping bombs that had done notable damage and killed 1,000 people. The very thought of it happening again, perhaps to a greater extent thanks to the proliferation of more modern weapons, more ways of killing, of destroying cities and lives, was terrifying. Some people were suggesting that those who prophesied war were exaggerating, and that this man, Hitler, who sought a purist German state, could be appeased. Having heard some of the horrors, she didn't think so. Like many others, she was worried about her children being killed in their home, and the young men likely to be called up to fight for king and country, just like before. Did men never learn? At least those at the top didn't seem inclined to learn. And as for everyone else, small people could do nothing but hope and pray. Without the wireless, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. As it ticked away the seconds and minutes, Jenny felt the distance between her and the wireless announcement widen. It was behind her. She could forget it. A good night's sleep should set me right, she thought. At first she tossed and turned. Nothing seemed to settle her until she turned her mind to planning the following day. The garden beckoned. On sensing yet another day of spring sunshine, the plants had rushed into the exuberant bloom one would expect in summer. So had the privet hedges which surrounded every house on the estate, small cascades of white flowers with a strong smell. They needed trimming. A bright day came with the dawn. Once the girls had left for school and the laundry was hanging on the line, Jenny prepared everything she needed. Her old gardening boots had seen better days, but they were waterproof and comfortable, mainly because they were 2 sizes too big. After collecting a pair of shears, she headed out front. She had every intention of attacking the hedge with a vengeance. Her hope was that a combination of physical effort and enjoying the fresh air would blot out the rest of the world and its troubles. Her world would narrow down to the everyday things, the insignificant things that she had some control over, such as the privet hedge. Privet leaves and bits of twig flew up her arms and around her face, and she began to relax, and then to hum to herself and dance tunes that she'd heard on the wireless. It seemed that the shears snipped in time to the music. The world suddenly seemed a better place. Mondays remained laundry days to the sticklers for convention, though what difference the day made, Jenny found amusing. As far as she was concerned, as long as the weather was dry and a stiff breeze blowing, it didn't much matter what day the laundry was hung out. Today looked just perfect for hanging out a line. She'd pegged hers out early before the girls were up. At 10:15, she went back inside and made herself a cup of tea and took the last 2 biscuits from the biscuit barrel. Peace had returned to her own personal space. The short break was much enjoyed. Now, back to the garden. Coronation Close was quiet at this time of the day. The milkman had been and gone, and the vegetable man, fresh fruit and veg piled on the back of his horse-drawn cart, wouldn't be around until midday. Jenny set to with the shears, lopping off the longer pieces that dared escape the nice level head she required. Once she wiped at her forehead. She would have dipped straight back down and trimmed the lower hedge until she saw movement. Then a figure standing straight and still outside number 1 Coronation Close. She paused, wondering what he wanted. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't a neighbour. So, who was he? The close formed a horseshoe shape, so the numbers ran consecutively all around the circle of green grass from 1 to 12, although standing outside number 1, the stranger seemed transfixed by number 12. It occurred to her that he might be selling something, though she hadn't seen any sign of a case. Most of the tally men who came banging on doors carried their goods in suitcases, unless they were calling to collect the money due. They sold everything from household goods to books. Few of her neighbours could afford to buy books. It was household goods they favoured, new bedding, towels, crockery or children's clothes. "Well, I'm not buying, so he needn't think that," she murmured. Laying aside her shears, her attention turned to picking the last of this year's daffodils. She began humming again as she cut a few choice blooms, and smiled when she thought of the cobalt glass vase Robin Hubert had given her. The glass had been left as a pledge at his second-hand furniture and pawn shop at Philwood Broadway and never reclaimed. Either they'd moved away or decided they didn't need it anyway. The money given in exchange for the pledge had been more useful. It was like that for a lot of people. Valuable objects couldn't buy food or pay the rent. That's the way it was. It was a lovely vase. Robin had remarked on it being Bristol glass. Bristol glass was mostly blue, dark blue. He looked deeply into her eyes as he'd said that. She'd found herself blushing, just as she did now at the memory. Robin had refused to accept payment, and the thought of what he'd said broadened her smile. "Call it a bonus," he'd said, "or a late Christmas present." She'd pointed out that it was getting towards the end of April. Unperturbed, he'd responded, "Easter, then." "That's been and gone, too." "Imagine it's your 21st birthday." "Sorry I missed it." She'd laughed then, and smiled now. Robin always had an answer. They shared the same sense of humour, had been childhood friends, but had grown apart and married other people. Fate had since intervened. Her husband, Roy, had become a career soldier, informing her that he much preferred brothers-in-arms to a day job and living a domestic existence with her and the children. He'd assured her that he still loved the children. They'd grappled with poverty and unemployment during their marriage. Those things alone drained whatever affection they might once have had, which in turn had led to violence, and love turning to fear and even hate. It had taken several years before the parting of ways, and had been a relief for Jenny. Roy's temper and frequent bouts of violence had been a marriage made in anywhere but heaven. She couldn't blame him entirely for how he was. He'd come back from the Great War in 1918, fully expecting the promises made by those in power to come to fruition. Why shouldn't a man be given some kind of reward for having served his country? His hope had been short-lived. Not only could he not find a decent job, but finding somewhere to live had been difficult. From one series of cramped rooms in a shared house to another, until their last room in Blue Bowl Alley, in a crumbling slum close coupled with other ageing slums in the medieval heart of the old city. By hook or even crook, in the guise of a council official who also happened to have been one of Oswald Mosley's black shirts, they were offered a council house. It had meant a new start, though at the time Jenny hadn't known just how new. Shortly after coming to Coronation Close, the truth came out, and Roy had declared proudly, excitement shining in his eyes, that he'd joined the army. That was what he wanted. Jenny had simply wanted a decent house in which to bring up her daughters. While Jenny's life had been governed by Roy, Robin's had been governed by Doris. Their marriage had been based on a lie, but Robin had believed Doris when she told him that she was pregnant and that he was the father. His parents had still been alive and had insisted he married the girl. That's how it was. Young men were expected to do the right thing. Young women were expected not to get into trouble in the first place. It had been a case of marry in haste, repent at leisure. 18 months after their wedding day, Doris's declaration of being in the family way at last proved true when she gave birth to their daughter, and a son had followed. "Longest pregnancy in history," Robin's mother had grumbled. Happy ever after had not happened. Doris became bored not only with domestic life, but with marriage in general, and Robin in particular. There were rumours of her having fancy men. Robin was mortified, but had put up with her for the sake of the children. No amount of arguing or threats had any effect. Not that Robin was the type to ever raise his hand to a woman, and Doris knew it. Her behaviour never improved. She started quarrels just so she, sometimes for a few days. "I've been with friends," she would tell him when she bothered to return. "Can't stick here in this bloody house all day waiting for you to come home." It became a waste of time to accuse her of starting the quarrels deliberately. Over time, it got that he couldn't care less. Not that it seemed to bother her. She preferred her companions at the Black Horse, the George, and the Bunch of Grapes to him. She came back displaying the attitude that she was doing him a favour, keeping him dangling on a string. "Like a bloody puppet," he often stated, and he had been that, accepting her back from whatever company she'd been with for the sake of the children. Jenny fully accepted that she and Robin had made regrettable mistakes. Both were now separated from their spouses, and fate had thrown them back together again, but only as friends, good friends. She now worked part-time for him at his second-hand furniture and pawn shop, which gave her independence, plus a little money. Doris, who, even though living elsewhere, still demanded maintenance from him, thus Jenny was only paid a few pounds. If he dared complain, Doris's riposte would be, "Wouldn't want the kids to do without, would you?" It was sheer blackmail. Being of a kindly nature, Robin did his duty by his wife, and his generosity wasn't only confined to his family. Sometimes he gave furniture away to those who needed it. He sold and exchanged furniture at the front of the shop, and had a pawn shop at the rear, just as his mother had done down in Stokes Croft, a busy area of shops and bustling traffic close to St. James's Church. He was the man someone went to for a bit of furniture, or a few shillings to last them until payday. On his mother's death, Robin had carried on with the business, moving it out of the city centre into the heart of one of the new council estates to the south of the city. The bevy of shops on either side of the expanse of green at Philwood Broadway, including his, served the post-Great War sprawling red-brick council estate of Knowle West. Business was as brisk here for him as it had been for his mother, trading in the heart of the city. His mother had always said that being in the pawnbroking business was like being on a merry-go-round that never went anywhere and never stopped. Those a bit short of cash at the beginning of one week came in to pawn their valuables, retrieved them on payday, usually a Friday, and brought them along again on Monday. Those were the ones Robin never made much money on, but at least a regular shilling was better than 10 rarely seen. The business was doing as well as could be expected. His marriage was not. Robin and Doris were currently living apart. Robin's wife had insisted on staying in rooms in a tenement owned by Robin learned that indeed he was far more than that. Robin's young daughter had told him so.
Ma sleeps with Uncle.
It shouldn't have come as a massive surprise, but to hear the truth from the mouth of his 10-year-old daughter had knocked him sideways. Yet another man passing through Doris's life, one of many. He'd finally faced up to the fact that Doris wasn't suited for marriage and never would be. Unlike most women who persevered for the sake of their children, Doris chose to go all out for what she really wanted, and she wanted other men. She liked a fun time and a bit of variety. Many people ostracized those who threw in the towel and became separated or divorced, but Robin had held his head high, bought the shop in Philwood Broadway, and threw himself into his business and providing for his children. Because he had to work, the children had remained with their mother. He made sure he saw them frequently, though Doris couldn't have cared less one way or the other, so long as he paid her maintenance. Marriage, thought Jenny, as she snipped the last daffodil, is not necessarily made in heaven. Hers certainly hadn't been, and neither had Robin's. Enough daffodils cut to fill the vase, Jenny straightened and slipped the scissors into her apron pocket. She was about to go back into the house, but her attention was taken by the man she'd seen earlier. He was still standing on the pavement outside No. 1 Coronation Close, the house that used to be occupied by Mrs. Partridge. Mrs. Partridge had died in Coronation year 1937. Mr. Partridge, who had spent years pretending to be her sister, had been imprisoned for deserting from the trenches in which he'd served during the Great War. Explosions, death, blood and destruction had broken his nerve. He'd deserted, and with the help of his wife, he'd lived as a woman for years, until his wife had died. Then he'd thrown in the towel, given himself up. He'd been led away on the day of the coronation, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth had been crowned in the glory that was Westminster Abbey. Everyone presumed Mr. Partridge was still in prison, but nothing had been heard from him since. Her former neighbours had been keen gardeners, but things had changed since the rough-and-ready Arkell family had moved in. Gone were the blossoms from the front garden that used to fill the air with perfume and colour. Gone, too, were the vegetables from the back garden. The Arkell kids had been seen selling bunches of flowers outside the cemetery. The vegetables sold door to door for a few coppers. Whilst the man's attention was fixed elsewhere, he was of average height and average build. In fact, everything about the man leaning against next door's privet hedge was average, including his clothes. He was dressed in a brown gabardine mac, the collar turned up around his face. His hands were buried deep in his pockets. It occurred to her that he might be from the council, come to read the riot act to Mr. or Mrs. Arkell. Not that he'd get much joy there. Mr. Arkell avoided anyone of authority. If he was home, he'd send out his wife, Roselia. Mrs. Arkell would beam and say, in amongst the machine-gun quick Spanish, "Me no speak English." It was a lie. She could certainly speak it when she wanted to. But while it was the privet hedge of No. 1 he was leaning against, he was staring across the road at No. 12. Yes, there was no doubt in her mind now that his attention was fixed on Thelma Dawson's house. But why would he be watching Thelma's place? In her mind, Jenny sought for possibilities that might entice a council visit. Precious few queued up to be recognised. Thelma paid her rent on time, and besides the fact that she was an honest woman, she had an ongoing relationship with Cuthbert Throgmorton, senior rent collector. If anything was amiss, she would hear it from him first. Nor was she a problem neighbour. She kept her house neat and tidy, had a steady job, and was not unduly noisy. On the contrary, she exercised her authority when someone wasn't keeping their pig bin clean or leaving a trail of clinker around the base of their ash bin. Thelma liked things just so. What if the King and Queen came visiting? She was fond of saying. Want it all neat and tidy when they turn up, don't we? The chances of royalty ever making its way into Coronation Close were slim, but Thelma, a keen collector of coronation memorabilia and fervent royalist, lived in hope. Thelma had made Jenny more than welcome when she'd first moved into Coronation Close. She knew something of Jenny's life before she'd moved into the close, as it was termed. So Jenny felt she owed her friend a few favours, and keeping an eye on Thelma's house when she was at work was one of those she didn't mind doing at all. But what now? Should she ask the man outright why he was so interested in her house? No, but she had to question him in some way. Perhaps say something friendly that wouldn't betray her suspicion of him. She took a deep breath. Flowers clutched in her hand, the blooms nestling in the crook of her arm, she trailed along the hedges to the front gate of her own garden. Across the road at Thelma's house, the buds of a yellow climbing rose, only just coming into bud, were nodding in a smiley manner above the privet hedge. A few had dared to burst open, despite it being too beautiful, aren't they? Well, he was looking in that direction. He started, turned his head, and stared at her. The roses across the road at number 12? They're beautiful, and so are these for that matter. He looked surprised to see her there, as though he'd been so engrossed in his mission of watching Thelma's that he hadn't noticed her. His eyes were blue, his face very pale. She got the impression that his hair was reddish, though couldn't tell for sure on account of the brim of his trilby. The daffodils, she said, and nodded at the flower heads, bright as suns against the dark green of her cardigan. I know people say that snowdrops are the first sign of spring, but it's not until the daffodils begin to dance in a March breeze and are still cheering us up in April. That's when I think spring has finally arrived, and that summer is on the doorstep. She patted the daffodil heads affectionately. Of course, it's nearly the end of April, and a surprise that they're still blooming. The daffodils are late, and those rosebuds across the road are early. The weather's been wonderful for the time of year. Really warm. It was as if she'd awoken him from a deep sleep. He hunched his shoulders, pulled the brim of his brown trilby hat further down over his face, and then was gone. Like a rabbit, she thought. Through narrowed eyes, she watched until he turned left at the end of the cul-de-sac and disappeared. There was no doubt in her mind that he'd been surveying Thelma's house and that she'd taken him by surprise. Creepy, she thought. Why'd he been staring so intently? It crossed her mind that he might be contemplating breaking in and taking whatever valuables he could find. Thelma would be heartbroken if anyone stole her royal crockery collection. She'd built it up over several years and guarded her mugs, cups, saucers and plates like the crown jewels. Jenny had only ever known one item of that collection being broken. A coronation mug depicting King Edward VIII had been her most treasured possession back in 1936. Not because it had been a present from Cuthbert Throgmorton, which it had been, but because Thelma had thought King Edward the handsomest of the royal family. It had been to the amazement of the world, Parliament, the Lords and the Commons that Edward declined to be king, instead declaring his intention to marry an American divorcee. Thelma's anger had boiled over. He'd let the country down, but worse than that, he'd let her down. Furious beyond belief, she had smashed the mug to pieces. Turning thoughtfully back to the house with both the cut flowers and her shears, Jenny tried to convince herself that there must be a perfectly logical reason for the man being there. Back in her living room, she turned the wireless on. Music for now, but when the pips sounded for the news, she would turn it off. It was as she was arranging the flowers in the pretty glass vase that her thoughts turned back to the man she'd failed to recognize, and another possibility which made her pause and go quite cold. Way back at the beginning of last year, during a severe snowstorm in 1937, a man had attacked Thelma and left her in the family way. The pregnancy had not come to fruition, But angry that he'd taken advantage of her and fully aware the police would do nothing, Thelma had found out where he lived. His name was Sam Hudson, and to Thelma's horror, she had discovered that he didn't live that far away. "I want to face him down," Thelma had said, yet again stoutly refused to report him to the police. Jenny understood that. She'd heard many a tale of the police not wanting to know. Their belief seemed to be that women were hysterical creatures, but also too licentious for their own good. It was always their fault. They led men on. Women only had themselves to blame. That seemed to be the opinion of the police and men in general. "I'll face him, and then I'll announce what he is to all and sundry." "Do you think you should?" Jenny had cautioned. Eyes blazing, Thelma had ground her teeth. "I have to, love. Otherwise I'll go mad." Jenny had heard all about it, how Thelma had stood on the pavement outside, staring at that closed front door. Even the rows of stone gnomes in the front garden of his house had failed to make her smile. They were too much like him, grinning faces that mocked rather than welcomed. Going there on a weekday had been a mistake. He was at work. Of course he was. She had ended up meeting his wife, Beryl, a poor, disabled woman, downtrodden, sometimes confined to her bedroom and living a life of hell. Instead of confronting her attacker, Thelma had befriended his wife. Jenny considered now that the stranger could be him. She imagined mentioning the man to Thelma. "Some bloke weighing you up for a weekly payment for a pair of bath towels?" she would quip, and leave Thelma to surmise who it might be. Her comment would be met with a quick-witted response. She could imagine it now, right down to the words Thelma was likely to use and the expression she was likely to pull. "I don't give a jot, as long as he wasn't weighing me up for a coffin." It almost made Jenny burst out laughing, until she wondered again whether it might have been Sam Hudson. She herself had never seen him, so she couldn't know for sure. She went out into the kitchen to peel vegetables for this evening's meal and make sandwiches, doorstep sandwiches, cold meat with pickle, enough to keep them going for the rest of the school day, until they came home at 4 o'clock. As she scraped potatoes and sliced carrots, she decided that, yes, of course Thelma had to be told, but not until later this evening. Thelma's son George and his wife were coming to dinner that evening. If she mentioned it at all, it would be after George and daughter-in-law Maria had gone back to the 2 rooms they were renting in Montpellier. And what shall I tell her? He wore a brown hat and coat. I didn't get much of a glimpse at his face, but think his hair might have been sandy or reddish. She wasn't quite sure which. After putting the potatoes and carrots into the same saucepan, Jenny wiped her hands and went into the living room. Looking out of the front window across the road to the closed front door, she thought of Thelma. She would be blithely looking forward to an evening with her family after a long day at work. Just leave her to enjoy it, she thought, and no doubt Thelma would. She loved all 3 of her children, but at times it seemed that George was her favourite. There were some things Thelma wasn't looking forward to. She conveyed these to Jenny in private. "Maria wants to do the cooking. Something Italian. Do you think I should let her?" She'd wanted to burst out laughing at this, but stopped when she saw that Thelma was deadly serious. Instead of laughing, Jenny had done her utmost to reassure her. "Why not? It'd be nice to let someone else wait on you. Besides Mary and Alice, that is." Thelma had nodded. "Yes, they're good girls. And George is a good boy. Give his wife a chance." "Yes, I suppose you're right. It'll be good to have the whole family around the table, even if we'll be eating something Italian." George had returned from the Merchant Navy with an Italian wife. At first, Thelma had been somewhat disappointed that her son had not married a local girl. To some extent it was a jealous wish. A Bristol girl was likely to remain in her home city, which meant Thelma would get to see her beloved son on a regular basis, and if grandchildren did come along, she'd get to spoil them rotten before handing them back. It's what grandmothers did. Thelma's greatest fear had been that Maria would persuade George to live in Italy, where her own relatives would be on the doorstep. Women were nest builders, no matter where they came from, and girls especially liked to be close to their mothers. Maria's mother was back in Italy. Even though Thelma had never known her own mother, she knew what a draw it could be. Being close to family meant a lot. So far, Maria had given no sign that she had taken George and whatever children they had with her. "But that doesn't mean it won't happen," Thelma had declared gloomily. Jenny had asked if she'd asked George about his plans. "It all depends on if he decides not to go to sea again. I'm hoping he won't, but he's in two minds. He loves the sea, but he's got himself this temporary job at the tobacco bonds. He wants to see if he can stand being a landlubber, as he terms it. But that doesn't mean he won't go to sea again or return to Italy." "Can Bert help them get a council house? They'd likely stay in this country if they've got their own place. Their rooms in Montpellier are reasonable and the rent's cheap, but a family should have a proper house." "I don't know. I haven't asked him. But I will." In a few months' time, Maria would give birth to Thelma's first grandchild, an event she was very much looking forward to. Thankfully, there was no way for the foreseeable future that either George or Maria was going anywhere. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 12, interrupting Jenny's random thoughts and concerns. The sandwiches were ready and waiting on the table. Now all she had to do was put the kettle on and make herself a cup of tea. She would enjoy midday with her daughters, a happy time when she listened to their chatter about school, friendships, and that morning's arithmetic test. She had no doubt the 12-year-old Tilly had done well. What the fickler and younger Gloria had done was a different matter. She had a devil-may-care attitude to the world. In some ways it could be her downfall. In others, it might get her far, mused Jenny. Teapot ready, water boiled, Jenny was just about to spoon 2 scoops of tea from the caddy into the pot. The simple task was interrupted by the sound of something falling through the letterbox. The second post of the day had arrived. Once the water had been poured and the tea was brewing, she went to check what had fallen onto the coconut mat immediately inside the front door. A sudden something, like a whispered warning, caused her to pause. Rarely did she receive second post. People like her didn't get much drop through their letterbox unless it was from the council. Gas and electricity were paid with pennies or shillings into meters in the hallway. Shaking her head did little to dislodge the premonitions that idled there. Silly, really. She told herself she was being daft, but the feeling of an impending problem wouldn't leave her. The chill of the hallway met her as she opened the door, and there was also the coconut mat with an item of post settled on it. The item that had fallen through her letterbox was not a letter. A weird, wobbly feeling cramped her stomach, a sign of premonition. But a premonition of what? Jenny didn't know anyone likely to send her a postcard. Nobody she knew was on holiday, and even if they were, it would probably only constitute a day trip to the seaside and a saucy postcard to tell her how bracing it was. She was vaguely aware of the picture on the front being a handsome white building surrounded by tropical trees, palm trees, no doubt. A road ran in front of the white building where Chinese men pulled rickshaws. 2 men wearing uniforms and turbans on their heads stood either side of the entrance. She presumed them to be Indian. Even before she saw the familiar handwriting, the sight of which pierced her heart, she knew who was writing to her. She only feared why. Heart pounding, she turned the postcard over and almost dropped it when she read the words. Jenny, a nurse is writing this for me. I've been taken ill. Arrangements have been made for me to come home. I've been discharged. See you soon. Regards, Roy. No, dear Jenny, dear wife, or with love. Rain began to patter against the window and trickle like tears down the cold glass. The sunshine had gone, and, to top it all, her husband was coming home. Chapter 2. Thelma turned the corner into Coronation Close, full of apprehension about Maria's meal. Tonight, they would usually have cold meat left over from the weekend joint, with bubble and squeak made from potatoes and other sundry vegetables from Sunday dinner. The meat would have been served cold with piccalilli, and the vegetables boiled the day before. The whole lot would have been fried in a frying pan with a good dollop of lard. The smell of something being fried in lard would have laid heavy on the air. So absorbed was she about what might happen in her kitchen, she didn't hear Jenny calling across the road the first time, but heard her the second. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." Thelma looked at her front door and back again. "Can it wait until the family are gone? We're eating an Italian meal this evening," she called back. "It's something called spaghetti bolognese. Maria is cooking." "I know, I remember you telling me." Jenny grinned. "Stop looking so worried about it. She's not going to poison you. I'll see you later." Thelma had never eaten foreign food of any description and wasn't sure what to expect as she entered her house. "I'm home," she called. The smell hit her the moment she entered the living room. So did the sound of clattering dishes, excited chatter, and Gracie Fields singing full throttle on the wireless. Mary and Alice were seated around the dining table. George was keeping the girls occupied with a game of snakes and ladders. The smells were delicious, a significant improvement on what they might normally have had this evening. George noticed his mother's distraction. "She's a brilliant cook, Ma. Stop worrying." The sound of Maria singing in Italian drifted in from the kitchen. With a wry smile, George commented that his wife was very fond of singing from morning till night. "Ain't got a bad voice neither," he proudly remarked to his mother. "You're right there," returned Thelma, though if asked, she'd have to admit she hadn't a clue. Someone had once suggested she was tone deaf, but she wasn't quite sure. The expectancy on the faces of her daughters added to the sense of an impending adventure. Alice inhaled deeply and licked her lips. "Maria's cooking smells lovely. Don't you think so, Ma?" "Wish she'd hurry up," grumbled Mary. George directed his mother to her favourite armchair. "Come on, Ma. Take the weight off your feet. Maria don't need your help. This is supposed to be a treat. Now come on, sit down. I'll pour you a sherry. Just a small one." There were occasions nowadays when her children made her feel as though the times for indulging them were over. The time for indulging her, like an old granny, though she felt far from that, had come. Maria poked her head around the door. "Hello, Mama. I have all ready in an hour." Tresses of her daughter-in-law's hair were plastered to her forehead. Her cheeks were red, and her swelling belly thrust against her pinny. Thelma had been told she was going to be a grandmother at the end of last year. She'd been counting the days ever since. It wouldn't be long now. Thelma offered her help in the kitchen. Maria shook her head. "I do this." She promptly disappeared. George tutted at his mother and shook his head. "Relax, Ma." It was easy to say, but hard to do. Thelma fidgeted, fingers tapping a beat on the arms of the chair. Not exactly in time with Gracie on the wireless, more in time with the seconds and minutes ticking past before she went to see what Maria was up to. The kitchen was ostensibly her domain, although since they were quite young, Mary and Alice were in the habit of preparing an evening meal for her on her return from Bertram's Modes, the dress shop where she worked. However, dishes she'd taught them to make. She was used to them cooking good old-fashioned West Country feasts like faggots and peas, shepherd's pie, pig's trotters, mutton stew and boiled ham with cheese and leek sauce. Although itching to see what was happening out in her kitchen, Thelma asked her daughters what sort of a day they'd had at school. In the past, they might have chatted 13 to the dozen, telling her every little thing that had constituted their day at Connaught Road School. Halfway between being children and becoming young women, these days they were less open about their lives. Alice, perhaps because she was younger, was more enthusiastic than Mary, who had become more reticent. Of late, Thelma had found herself nudging them into telling her things, though on this occasion she was only half taking things in. The sounds and smells coming from the kitchen were impossible to ignore. Finally, when the girls had fallen to silence, their hunger taking precedence over the happenings of the day, they began fiddling with the cutlery. "It's no good. I must go out there." She was up in a flash, edging her way around the large oak dining table that took up most of the space in the living room. George leapt from his chair and placed himself between her and the door into the kitchen. "Oh, no, you ain't. None of you are going in there. Maria wants to cook a traditional Italian dish for you without anybody's help. She can cook," he added. "Look at this." Grinning from ear to ear, he patted his belly lovingly. Love for his food, as well as his wife. Thelma pulled a face. She wouldn't say it out loud, but had to agree that he'd put on weight since being married to Maria. "As long as she can cope." "Of course she can cope. Italian girls are brought up to be wizards in the kitchen." Thelma whispered, "I'm just a bit worried. I might not like what she's cooking. I wouldn't want to offend." George shook his head at her. "Mother, there's no need to worry. She wants to cook you something they cook in Italy most days of the week. Pasta. In this case, spaghetti." "Pasta?" "They eat it as regularly as we eat potatoes, but it's made of wheat, I think." Trying to look or behave meek and mild, obedient even, had never come easily to Thelma. Pushing 40, she was still a force of nature, a whirlwind round the house, a more sedate one when working in Bertram's, but quite capable of holding her own with the posh women that came in. She could speak to people on all levels and with great confidence. But this? She was all aflutter, simply because her kitchen had been invaded. There was one more option open to her. "I need the bathroom." It was downstairs and tucked away. George threw her a look of outright disapproval and shook his head dolefully. "Got a bit of a waterworks problem today," she declared, and swept past with a determined and slightly smug look on her face. Her curiosity was almost killing her. What in the world was Maria doing to make all that racket? "All right," Thelma said cheerfully, and nodded at Maria. "Si. Yes." Maria took no notice and carried on with what she was doing. Thelma sauntered on, aware that George was standing in the doorway. "Well," she thought as she shut the bathroom door behind her, "it comes to something when a son watches to make sure that his mother goes to the WC." Her brief intrusion into the kitchen had revealed that a great deal of stirring and clattering was going on. Steam filled the room and gathered in clouds close to the ceiling. The vapour turned to water, trickling down the walls and window panes. Even though the window was open, it hung there, only slowly dissipating out into the back garden. Whatever was being cooked smelt spicy, appetizing, and not at all British. What with the steam and pretending she needed the bathroom, she'd not had enough chance to get a good look at everything. She made a fresh attempt as she exited the bathroom. Few of the ingredients were known to her, except for the grated cheese and a bundle of chopped-up parsley. A quick stretching of her neck in the direction of the stove revealed something that looked like tomato soup bubbling in one of her larger saucepans. Something else bubbled away in her biggest saucepan, a heavy cast-iron one that she could barely lift. Maria was pressing dough through a kitchen tool she'd never seen before. It had a handle on the side, and when Maria turned it, strips came through. "Are you sure you don't need any help?" Thelma asked, although it did look as though she had everything under control. No, returned Maria, shaking her head, her attention firmly fixed on stirring each saucepan in turn. "I can manage." Curiosity unsatisfied, Thelma grimaced. The urge to poke her nose in was overwhelming. "Ma?" Suspicious of his mother's intentions, George appeared in the doorway between kitchen and living room. He crooked his finger at her. "Come on, sit down and stop interfering." Meekly, though still itching to be involved, Thelma went back into the living room and sat down obediently when George pulled back her chair and pointed at the seat.
"This is my house," she thought to herself. "I've got rights to go where I want."
Going and doing what she wanted, which had been and still was in an outer suburb of the city called Fish Ponds. It had been surrounded by the Duchesses, a place of green grass and trees, a weir, and the ever-flowing water of the river Frome. Back then, Thelma had made a vow that she would always go and do whatever she wanted in life. Years had passed, but that vow had stayed with her. She began to rise from the chair. "I really think—" "No, you don't." Placing his hands on her shoulders, George pressed his mother back onto the chair. "You don't want to be an interfering mother-in-law, do you, Ma?"
"Well, there's a thing to say. I am no such thing."
Some of her neighbours had complained of an interfering mother-in-law. She'd even heard of one who had accompanied their son and his bride on honeymoon, treating it as a kind of holiday. "You sit whilst I help Maria with the plates." She let herself be persuaded, though only because it seemed the food was about to be dished up. Composing herself with a deep breath and sitting straight at the table, she addressed her daughters, whose eyes were fixed on the kitchen.
"Well, isn't this nice? It smells as though we've got a treat in store,"
she declared with great enthusiasm that she hoped would hide her anxiety. The fact was, she so wanted to put Maria at her ease and reassure her son that she no longer cared that he hadn't married a local girl, she decided a bit of praise was in order. She turned to her daughters and repeated what she'd already said. "I think we're for a rare treat. What do you think, girls?"
"It smells nice,"
said Alice. The sound of Mary's stomach rumbling was proof enough that she too appreciated the smell and made both girls giggle. A crescendo of clattering resumed in the kitchen. "I wonder if Italian cooking always makes that much noise," thought Thelma, "or sends so much steam up in the air and condensation running down the window panes." She looked at the living room windows. The steam had travelled in from the kitchen and misted them too. Knives, forks and spoons had already been set out on the table. A cast-iron trivet had also been placed in the middle of the table, ready to take a saucepan. "We need another trivet for the sauce," George shouted. An outstretched brown arm came through the door and passed him a smaller one, which he placed beside the first one. "All set," George shouted to his wife. Thelma restrained herself from asking what was going on. The only time she put trivets on the table was for a saucepan of stew thick with doughboys. Rarely had she placed 2 trivets on the table, except perhaps for a hot meat platter at Christmas, one for the chicken and one for the roast potatoes. The ones she'd seen on the gas stove. Those were the reasons. Regardless of her inner turmoil, Thelma kept smiling. She didn't want to appear the disapproving mother-in-law. She wanted to be friends with her son's wife.
"It is ready,"
cried Maria. Using both hands, she entered, cradling a huge bowl against her belly. Thelma recognized it as the one she normally used for making pastry. Certainly not as a serving bowl. It was just too big. Sensing this was an opportunity for her to help, she rose to her feet.
"Maria, you shouldn't be carrying that in your condition."
"Ma!" Placing his hands on her shoulders, George pressed his mother back down in the chair as he had done before. "Sit down and stop fussing."
"Spaghetti, the food of Italy," trilled Maria with smiling face and flashing eyes.
It was as though she hadn't noticed Thelma's offer of help at all. The food seemed to be all that mattered.
"Use a fork and spoon."
Mary and Alice stared round-eyed at the steaming bowl set in the middle of the table, whilst Thelma did her very best to hide what she was feeling. trepidation for a start, plus the sense that something was missing.
"We need the plates, Georgie."
George followed his wife back out into the kitchen and brought the plates in. Maria came back carrying the smaller of the large saucepans. This she placed on the smaller trivet.
"This is the bolognese sauce,"
she sighed with satisfaction, her eyes holding a yearning for validation.
"Now, help yourselves. There are things to use for serving, or we can do it for you."
"Sit down, darling." George gently pressed his wife down onto a dining chair in the same way that he had his mother. "Dig in, everyone. Use the tools provided. You might think it all looks a bit haphazard, but trust me, trust us. They'll all work fine." There were indeed some useful implements. To Thelma's surprise, she recognized the tongs she used to lift the laundry from the boiler. The handle of the only ladle she owned stuck out above the smaller bowl. Everyone had been provided with knives, forks, and spoons. She'd never tasted spaghetti and was worried she might not like it. What if it wasn't to her taste? What if she disliked it so much that she spit it out? Maria would be mortified if she did that. "Right," Thelma said, determined to tuck in with gusto and hope for the best. "I think it might be better if you two serve it up. We don't want to drop any, do we?" Husband and wife began to dish up.
"You will like it. I'm sure you will,"
Maria declared in staccato accented English. Thelma's heart went out to the girl. She was desperate to impress her English relatives, especially her mother-in-law. Thelma watched as George deftly handled her laundry tongs, dipping them into the bowl and bringing out long strips of what did look a bit like white worms. Not that they were, of course. A steaming plate was placed in front of her.
"Now this,"
said Maria. She dipped the ladle into the saucepan. The smell was rich and pungent. Meat and tomatoes, herbs and spices, onions. Yes, she definitely got a hint of onions. Thelma prepared to tuck in.
"I do hope you like it, Mama."
Maria had brought her Italian ways as well as her cooking. She always called her Mama, and although today cooking had prevented it, she usually gave her a big hug and a kiss on each cheek. Thelma smiled and thanked her for preparing such a delicious meal. Maria beamed. She had a childlike innocence about her, wanted to get involved in the British way of life, to be liked and fit in. It was impossible not to like Maria, not to be impressed by her luminous brown eyes and glossy dark hair. Her skin was like creamy coffee, and she didn't wear stockings. She didn't need to. Her legs like